Mr. President, 1 month ago today, Hamas launched its unprovoked attack on the state of Israel, on innocent men, women, and children, civilians, all. Hamas entered the country by land, air, and sea, and they brutally murdered more than 1,400 Israelis. They also took hundreds of hostages, some of whom were American citizens. They abused and assaulted innocent civilians and left a trail of devastation in their wake. In the face of Hamas's barbaric attack, Israel has done what any country would do and defended its citizens and its sovereignty, and it has every right to do so. This basic truth has somehow become a point of confusion in some circles, but we should not be confused. Many on the far left, including at least one member of the House of Representatives, have pointed to Israel's defense as an example of what she calls genocide. They act as though Israel was the aggressor here, not Hamas. They've called on the president to speak out against the actions of the victim, not the aggressor. It's as though they think Israel is somehow the moral equivalent of the terrorist group Hamas. It's especially disturbing to see this rhetoric spreading on social media, because many people who are not familiar with the facts, the circumstances, and the history of Hamas and Israel, Iran, and Hezbollah, they may actually believe the disinformation and propaganda that they see on social media. It's also very deeply disturbing to see how it is absorbed and embraced by many college campuses. And it's downright disturbing, of course, to see it repeated here in the halls of Congress. There should be no confusion. Hamas is the aggressor, and Hamas bears ultimate responsibility for the pain and suffering in Israel and in Gaza. Hamas's own tactics are the very reason for the loss of life in Gaza, and that it's been so high, because these terrorists who care nothing about the individuals have a long history of using Palestinian civilians as human shields for their own benefit. And then Hamas operates a vast network of tunnels underneath Gaza. The tunnels shield terrorists from the dangerous fighting above ground. They also store critical supplies like water, food, and fuel, which are being kept from the Palestinian civilians. As many of us are concerned about the humanitarian disaster caused by Hamas's attack on Israel, it is Hamas itself that is exacerbating and making the humanitarian crisis worse. It seems likely that the tunnels are also the hiding place for more than 200 hostages taken by Hamas last month. A video recently shared online of a Hamas gunman who was captured and interrogated by the Israeli officials was particularly revealing. He said that Hamas shelters in tunnels and basements under clinics, schools, and hospitals because they know the Israelis will not target those locations out of concern for the collateral damage or damage to innocent civilians. That's why Hamas deliberately places innocent Palestinians between its terrorist foot soldiers and incoming rockets. As a result of Hamas's human shield strategy, the number of civilian casualties in Gaza is devastating. There's no denying that. It's important, though, to remember that the pain and suffering that's occurring throughout Israel and Gaza is directly attributable to Hamas, a U.S.-designated terrorist organization serving as a proxy for the #1 state sponsor of terrorism, which is Iran. The blood of this war is clearly on Hamas's hands. As the fighting continues, I'm reminded of the saying that's been around for years. If Hamas laid down its weapons today, there would be no more violence. If Israel laid down its weapons, there would be no more Israel. Hamas is not fighting for peace. It's trying to wipe Israel off the map, again, as a proxy for its sponsor, which is the supreme leader in Tehran. They all share a desire to wipe the Jewish state off the map entirely. The United States cannot equivocate between good and evil. We must stand with Israel. There's no question that words are important. We have a responsibility to voice our support, speak out against Hamas, and call out dangerous anti-Semitic slander when we see it. But words alone are not enough. America has a responsibility to come to the aid of our ally with the resources it needs, not only to fight, but to actually win this war. This includes air defense systems that safeguard Israeli people from rocket attacks. It includes intelligence support to stay one step ahead of the terrorists. And it includes military aid to find and eliminate the Hamas threat. As part of that commitment, Congress has a big job to do. We need to pass a supplemental funding bill to ensure Israel has the tools it needs to defeat Hamas terrorists. And last week, the House of Representatives did just that. They passed an Israel aid bill with bipartisan support. Their legislation would provide up to $14.3 billion to ensure that Israel has the resources they need to defend themselves. Our friends across the Capitol offset the spending by reallocating a portion of the bloated IRS funding from the Democrats' massive so-called Inflation Reduction Act. I would add that that was $14.3 billion out of an $80 billion appropriation to the Internal Revenue Service. Hardly the majority of that funding. But if our colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't like those pay-fors, then they're free to come up with an alternative. But the truth is they don't believe in paying for anything. And we saw just last year, or this last year, about $670 billion paid by the United States to our bondholders to help finance the national debt. And that's not getting any better by the day. And certainly if we were to pass another supplemental appropriation bill to aid Israel or Ukraine or for any other purpose and actually make our national debt worse, it would put us on a perilous path. Well, President Biden, who said we stand with Israel and will do anything that they need us to do, has actually threatened to veto the $14.3 billion supplemental appropriation bill that was passed for the House. Now, how he can reconcile his stated support for Israel and his threat to veto a supplemental appropriation bill escapes me. And then there's the majority leader here in the Senate, the senator from New York, Senator Schumer, who said that the House bill is dead on arrival in the Senate. And he even took his opposition a step further, blasting this legislation as stunningly unserious and a joke. Well, I have to respectfully disagree with the majority leader. There's nothing funny about denying Israel the assistance it needs in defending itself against this terrorist threat. It's no secret that America's national debt has put us in an extremely vulnerable position. 13 years ago, Admiral Michael Mullen, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, warned that the most significant threat to our national security is our debt. That actually struck me as a little unusual at the time, but at that time, the national debt was roughly $13.5 trillion. Since then, it has more than doubled to $33.6 trillion and counting. So I think that's what he was getting at, is the more we end up spending money that we're borrowing from subsequent generations, and the more interest we have to continue to pay to people willing to buy our debt, we're going to have a whole lot less financial resources and flexibility that we need when unexpected things occur, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine or Hamas's invasion of Israel. We simply won't have the money and the flexibility to do what we expect America to do, which is to always lead and be a agent for peace and stability. If we continue at this pace, our children and grandchildren will have no chance of digging out from under this debt. There's an old saying that the best time to start was yesterday. The next best time to start is now. We have a responsibility to start chipping away at the national debt now, and certainly not to make it any worse. And every single spending bill is an opportunity to make tough but necessary choices to achieve that goal. I'm disappointed that the majority of our Democratic colleagues don't seem to have any interest in addressing this threat to our national security. Over the last couple of years, they spent, on a party line basis, $2.6 trillion without a single Republican vote. And now they blast an attempt to address the growing debt as unserious. Well, that $2.6 trillion in spending that our Democratic colleagues did on a party line basis was partly responsible for a 40-year high inflation rate that is eating up the standard of living of hardworking Americans across the country. I think the figure I saw indicates that this broken down per capita is roughly slightly under $1,000 in additional costs for the average family. Our Democratic colleagues, if they didn't like the pay for provided by the House of Representatives, they could have suggested different offsets. You can't tell me, given the amount of money the federal government spends, that it couldn't find offsets for $14.3 billion. Or the majority leader could have simply put the bill on the floor and left room open for an amendment process. But instead, he resorted to name-calling and trying to belittle the serious efforts that the House has undertaken, both to deal with the emergency in Israel and the national debt. In the next couple of weeks, the Senate and the House are going to have to work together to address the major issues that are swirling in front of Congress right now, which includes Israel, Ukraine, the border, and yes, keeping the government funded. This is hardly the way to start off on a good foot. Republicans and Democrats in Congress overwhelmingly support Israel. We agree that the United States needs to provide support for our ally. At the same time, we need to get serious about addressing another massive national security threat, which is our growing national debt and the crowding out of our ability to spend money on other necessary priorities instead of paying China and Japan, who own that debt. Washington has a spending problem. That's the first thing we need to acknowledge. And unfortunately, many of our colleagues are unwilling to acknowledge it. And we have to get it under control. So today marks 1 month since Hamas attacked Israel, and I'm disappointed that the Senate has yet to act on support, financial support for our closest ally in the Middle East. I have no idea what Senator Schumer's plans are to actually process this supplemental appropriation. I don't know how long Israel will have to sustain the onslaught of Hamas's rockets and terrorist attacks on its people before the United States Congress and the U.S. government will respond, as President Biden said we would. Under the leadership of Speaker Johnson, the House did its job. It passed legislation to provide $14.3 billion for Israel with bipartisan support. And so I come to the floor profoundly disappointed that Senator Schumer refuses to take up this emergency supplemental appropriation bill to aid Israel. The United States has a responsibility to stand with Israel. I think that's the consensus position here in Congress on a bipartisan basis. But it takes more than just words. It takes action. 1 month after the war began, is too long to respond to the needs that the people of Israel have and to defend their country and their way of life. So I hope we can see movement on this aid package for Israel sooner rather than later. Mr. President, I yield the floor.